I'd like to welcome everyone to a special address from our co-hosts at CQUniversity. We have Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Indigenous Engagement, speaking to us today, and I'd like to give her a warm round of applause. Welcome.
So, thank you for that. Just before I begin this afternoon in giving the address, I do wish to acknowledge this country and the peoples on whose land that I live and reside, sleep on, laugh on, love on, cry on, and also at times vision on and dream about in terms of education and training. And that is the land of the Durrumbal people and their elders past and present. And for us working in training and education, it's also around very much thinking about and being very mindful, conscious mindfulness around elders of the future. And I wish to acknowledge them too. I also am very conscious that today is NAIDOC week, and I'm sure that Mr. Wade Mann and possibly my Vice-Chancellor, Scott Bowman, also mentioned that this week is NAIDOC week, and there's lots of events happening either around Rockhampton, the greater Rockhampton area, and would be in your communities that you hail from as well. So if you're missing NAIDOC week, please know that you can participate here if you want to as well, and that NAIDOC happens everywhere, and I'm really mindful of that too today. I am going to be speaking about building success into access and enabling courses specifically. This is what I was asked to speak on this afternoon. But before I get into that, I think it's also important to think about where are Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people currently in Australia, because there's often misconceptions and perceptions around where we are, and particularly around education and training needs, or about looking at focusing on delivery into Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities. And I think having a snapshot of that works best first up. Then I'm drawing this afternoon on research work that was undertaken by myself and some colleagues around access and enabling courses at 3 universities. And I'm going to speak to that research and then draw broader conclusions. So you'll hear that. And then sum up with some of the recommendations that we found from that project, as well as from literature review, as well as from a national round table that we had in part in this room. So that's quite fitting. I'm talking about that this afternoon, with some colleagues from around Australia, but also from Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. So people I know are from Aotearoa here, may find that of interest that we engage people from there as well into this work. So what do we know? And in June 2015, the estimated Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population was 729,000. I'm sure there was a few more kids born that year based on the birth rates, but around 750,000 we talk of in a broad term. If we think about where Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people live, and I want people just to glance at the top 2 boxes, you'll see that the greatest percentage is in New South Wales, with the second being Queensland. If we add those states up together, that's 60% of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people actually live in New South Wales and Queensland. Okay. Followed by, and you've got them there in order, Western Australia, the Northern Territory, Victoria, South Australia, and so forth. In 2015, around 35% of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people actually lived in major cities. And what I'm meaning by that in terms of the major cities in the data is Brisbane, but not including Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast and Ipswich. Okay? Is including Sydney, is including Melbourne, but it's the main central part of Melbourne, not way out to Geelong. So 35%. 45% live in inner and outer regional, and 20% live in remote or very remote. And you know, you would be surprised, maybe you're not, but the number of people that contact my office or me or in an advisory capacity through this university or through other universities, who say, I'm thinking of offering a training program or an education program or doing research on work, and they name a community that is way, a couple of 100 kilometres and maybe 5, 10, 15 hours west of here. Okay? And that's kind of common, and maybe you folks don't do that, but people need to, part of the success for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people is about people really narrowing down to think about where the populations are that you work with, or you're going to work with, or you do work with, and really understanding those populations, those communities, and what their needs are. The largest populations, Brisbane, New South Wales, Central and North Coast, and Sydney Wollongong, and those three regions alone account for 29% of the total population. Based on the figures from ANU, Brisbane will be the leading Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community by 2020. Currently it's that New South Wales, Central and North Coast of Sydney or Western Sydney region. Okay, we look at the age, and I'm going to whiz through these now. I'm going to make up a bit of time because we started a bit late. But the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is much younger, and people in this room would know that from people who come through, rooms that you work in. And according to the 2011 census, about 36% of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were less than 15 years, compared to 18%, and 3.5% were over the age of 65 or over. I have put down there the projection statement that comes from ANU, which is the centre that looks at population data, and it's got a major focus on Aboriginal population data and demographics. There are some communities where 50% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations in those communities are 20 years of age or younger. There are some communities where 50% of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are under 18. Okay, so that should start to give you a sense of, okay, what's coming for you? What do you need to be looked at in terms of the vet sector, in terms of where things are at? That's what our diagram looks like, and it's not too good. I've copied that from somewhere else, but you can see down on that left-hand corner the percentage in terms of youth. That is increasing, and it's projected, as I said, in some communities it's getting younger, but overall it's getting younger. Okay. If we look at education, 92% of all year fives or 5 years of age, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were attending some form of educational institution, whether it's a school, community school, a whole range of kind of education sessions. So it's not that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't start out being disengaged or not going to school. 29% of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people reported Year 10 as their highest qualification. And then if we look at Year 12, 25% had completed Year 12. That's compared to 52% of non-Indigenous people. So something happens between that, 5 years of age, then Year 10. But really, when I go down and drill into the data, it's really around that Year 7, Year 8. I'm not talking years of age. I'm talking in the schooling system of Year 7, Year 8, Year 9. And then it just bomb dives. Just gets worse and worse. If we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who had attained a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with 4.6% compared to 20% of non-Indigenous people. So in terms of who may be coming in to do enabling and bridging, it's that group that's disengaged with schooling, or, that may have left school, that may be returning, maybe thinking about doing a degree, maybe having visions and dreams of, I see Daryl up there, maybe they're thinking about being an ambulance person or a paramedic, or maybe they're thinking about being an educator or a nurse or an engineer. We're in an engineering building. They've got a long way to track back if they've been disengaged from school, despite really attending school well as an early young person. If we look at schooling, this is one thing I say to people, don't ever be under the perception that we're not smart and not participating in terms of getting grades, because the data there really flies in that flag of saying, no, that's not correct. 79% of Year 3 Indigenous students were at or above the national minimum standard for reading. That's at or above the national minimum standard of reading. Well, 81% of Year 3 students were at or above the national minimum set for persuasive writing. And then we've also got the numeracy, 79%. And those other areas of skills base also reflect some of those statistics as well. I put these pictures up because in terms of looking at enabling or access success, I've often had to think about to myself, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about just getting that piece of paper, which the bottom photo, we've got 5 graduates who've all graduated from here, CQUniversity, from our tertiary entry program. We're talking about just getting that. Is that what we mean by success? that they have that piece of paper and then maybe go out in the community and get a job. It's not really the role of bridging, and I see Helen Huntley up there would say, naughty Bronwyn, you shouldn't be saying that. They're supposed to be here to go to university. But for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, that is a marker of success. They may come back later to undertake a degree or a vet program. The woman on the top, on the left-hand side of myself, and I saw her Saturday night at the NAIDOC ball, and she reminded me that, she's about to not be the Scholar of the Year, but I've still got a mileage till Friday, that she is the current 2015-2016 NAIDOC Scholar of the Year for this community. She undertook the tertiary entry program, and she's about to commence into degree studies. She also works full-time, and she has family and community responsibilities. And I think for her, talking to someone like her about success, it's around how does she manage all those balls together. It's not just about the actual bridging or enabling course. That success is sure that, but it's also all those other balls that come together for her and enabling her to be a strong person in herself to get through to the end and feel really good about it. So there's a range of markers when we were having preliminary discussions around what does success mean and how do we build that into programs that we have in this university, but also how do other people do that. So if I look at this project, we wanted to look at perspectives of success from not only students' point of view, but teachers participating in enabling courses' point of view. And here I'm using courses meaning, could be one unit or module, could be a whole course. We had to sort of have language that translated across institutions here. We wanted to be able to interpret success from students and teaching staff's perspectives, but we also wanted to understand how Indigenous learning journeys can respect and grow cultural identity while simultaneously developing study skills. We wanted to look at that. How can we do that? Because, one of the quests we have in this uni and other unis is the growing number of Indigenous students, but that sense of if people come to university or come to TAFE or come to an organisation or institution, about leaving their culture at the door or leaving it at the gate. And many of you may have read papers that state that or heard people talk about that, because there's nothing really in a sense that affirms people. If they're doing distance online or courses online, that can become even more alienating. So how do we grow the cultural identity as well as the study skills at the same time? And also understanding how enabling programs help Indigenous students to find their way in a tertiary institution in a strong way, not feel like they're fumbling. They might do that to start with, but how do they develop that real confidence around, yeah, I'm an Indigenous student at this institution and that's really great, and I'm not compromising my identity, and I'm feeling really good in terms of myself as an Indigenous person as well while I'm here. How do we bring all that together? So we know a few things around enabling education. We know that they're vital in assisting Indigenous students to enter and succeed at university or tertiary education broadly. We know that it helps if people can get an increased education. The stats are there, the data's there, that it does build stronger economic and sociocultural futures, not just for individuals, for those individual students, but additionally for their communities. And many of you would have seen evidence of that. You may have personal examples that you could quote off of evidence of that. That's without doubt. There's a fact on that. But there's little information that exists around the experiences of Indigenous students within enabling courses, and if you try and do a literature review, you'll see that. Very little. There'll be people talking about what course they offer, how they might have done a bit of pedagogy, how they've changed some curriculum, but they don't actually do any real evaluative work. It's really descriptive, and there's really little if you look at the whole field. If we look internationally, in terms of New Zealand, we look at the USA and Canada around Indigenous experiences also in enabling or bridging or access, the same story. Not a lot written. Very little around key ingredients for success, and we were able to navigate some funding from the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education and undertook a project in this area, and I've got listed there the names of the chief investigators. In terms of the pathway, we know, as I've said, it's vital. 50% of Indigenous students enter university or higher education providers via enabling programs. Not sure if people were aware of that. That's 1 in 2. It's over half. Okay? Over half of all Indigenous people come through enabling, bridging and access courses. And we might all know someone and we go, oh yeah, but they didn't. An Indigenous person who didn't, well, they're the other 50%. Okay? They're the other 50%. And there's some universities and education providers who may not have that 50-50% split. Places like University of Melbourne wouldn't. They've got those students tend to be the ones that sit on that other end of not needing enabling or bridging or access programs. They might for something like engineering, but not generally overall. University and a provider, dual sector university like CQUniversity and some of the others around, they can be sometimes the bulk for that year's entry in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. Okay? And you can see how that plays out in some of the data and statistics. Well, we can anyway. So we wanted to look at strengths-based approach to this work. I'm not sure if people have heard the word conscientization before, but it really means about being critically reflective and thinking about things and being socially aware of one's situation. We wanted to bed that down in this project. For me, as an Aboriginal woman, that's very much part of a lot of what I do in terms of the work being politically informed by what's happening in the day-to-day reality of Aboriginal people's lives and Torres Strait Islander people's lives, and working up solutions from that. And trying to move away from old deficit thinking of that disadvantage and deficit thinking concepts to solution-based. Looking at critical awareness, I've said that, and fundamental to changing people's reality. I will make a copy of these available if people want them. We did do some qualitative data. We pulled the literature review, as I said. We looked at the data that was available through the Commonwealth and some state and territory data. And we also did some semi-structured interviews where we had one-on-one interviews with staff currently in enabling programs at Charles Darwin University. It's one of the universities. I'm not sure if anyone here is from Charles Darwin. The other one was Federation University of Australia, or got a FUA acronym. Also previously known as Ballarat, and CQUniversity, or Central Queensland University. So they were the three, and picked because of their dual sector status in terms of having, you know, vet programs, degree programs, and also all having enabling or access programs. We also undertook then coding, integration of themes, and did all that, brought all that data together. We had originally thought about each site doing some of their own interviews, but as it panned out, we employed one person to visit all sites and collect the information. And then we had a national round table, which I mentioned earlier, with attendees from around Australia, not just from those three institutions, but from government, from some private providers of training, vocational training, other institutions, for example, Charles Sturt University attended, University of Southern Queensland and a couple of others, along with people from New Zealand. So we invited specific people from a number of institutions from New Zealand, Aotearoa. We had quite a large delegation from Te Whare Wananga o Awanuiarangi, which is a wānanga who offers Cert 1 through to PhDs at their institution. And it was really important for us to get an idea what they were doing too in terms of bridging, enabling, and then that whole flow path through, and particularly from the point of view as well of ingraining and affirming cultural identity within that institution and other institutions. Not that we wanted to copy what they're doing at any shape or form, but there are lessons that we can learn from. So what did people say? In terms of staffing, that staff were very quick to identify that an Indigenous culture needed to be part of course content. Now, we didn't just interview, by the way, people that were teaching Indigenous enabling or access programs here. This is across from mainstream and Indigenous programs, and it was also with Indigenous staff and non-Indigenous staff. So the majority of people did say that Indigenous culture, in terms of building success for Indigenous people in access and bridging, needed to have Indigenous culture built within content and needed to be focused and have a real sense of strength, a real sense of place, whether that was the place of where people were from or whether that was the place where people were now studying and living in to do their training and to do that education. Have an affirmation of identity and really think about how they communicated concepts of success. So was concepts of success, just, getting that assignment in on time? Or was the concept of success, and this was an example given of getting every assignment for that course in on time and doing really well and the best you could, and then moving to the next one and doing the same? And people had a whole range of ways they talked about success there. We put both ways methodology, supported by identity, but both ways has also, if anyone's aware of the both ways literature, it's also really morphed since the 70s and 80s. And sometimes people get trapped in that 70s and 80s sense of both ways when it's really morphed too and changed too. When some of the people who talk about both ways now say it's not just two ways, because you're bringing another culture, you're bringing all that together, so is that another way? Or what if someone is not a non-Indigenous Australian and could be a migrant from, say, Greece? Are they bringing their Greek parts of knowing, the non-Indigenous mainstream and Indigenous ways of knowing all together? So how does that work? Because it's more than both, it's more than two. So we had a lot of discussions around that. And we did have a lot of, disagreement around that too. Created a sense of belonging and closed the gap from the participants' point of view. So from students' point of view, maybe not in the policy sense, but how they felt as individuals in terms of success, they were working towards that. What did other people say generally in terms of across what was important, and also that what could be a really exciting part of the journey? And for me, like when I read the students' stories and heard some of their stories, what came through was the absolute thrill for some of them around their journey. It wasn't so much, they all talked about, it was hard, it was challenging, I failed this one time, I came back, I repeated, I had a break, I did all that. But through all of that was this thread of the excitement. And I don't necessarily think that we play on that enough. I think we build on that thing of, well done, you've done really well, congratulations, you got through all of that, but we don't really share in the excitement of the journey itself and the journey as process, the journey as outcome, the journey as success, aside that end point as well. When we talk in an Indigenous framing, we often talk about the importance of the process being equally important of the outcome. And for us, this kind of showed this in this work. So the words people used were transformative, built strength, self-esteem, resilience, confidence and self-worth. In terms of curriculum implications, the both ways methodology was supported, and I've said that, requires drawing away at times from mainstream processes. Now that became very challenging for us when we had our roundtable, because how do you do that? For example, in VET, if you're teaching a catering course and it's all about, making sauces, you might have to do that. There's times when, I'm not saying you would do that all the time, but there's times in other contexts when you may have to pull away from mainstream processes to add in some Indigenous processes of ways of thinking or some of the content. So that requires a bit of juggling. I'm not saying it's holus bolus here, but people have to really think about the curriculum and how they're overlaying it. When is it appropriate to pull back somewhat from some of the mainstream thinking when you can, and when is it not appropriate? Requires an understanding of how it plays out in the education institution, regardless of what institution you're in. And how do people start to adopt that thinking in their head, that both ways understanding in their head? Some of the content, it came up overwhelmingly that the system requires widespread cultural awareness, and that's something that this organisation is grappling with, as are others, but that people really have to get their heads around issues to do with Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander cultural awareness. Now, how long, some of you fellas that are sitting in this room here that I know, have we been hearing that? Okay. How long? And yet that's something that's still not right. I mean, when I was with the Commonwealth Health, we were saying that in the early 90s. When I was teaching in schools in the late 1980s and then again in the 2000s, it was the same thing. And yet we still see a struggle in trying to roll this kind of training out or education out for staffing, regardless of institution, regardless of training organisations or universities, government departments or whatever in Australia. We still struggle with it, even though It's been found over and over again, including in this study, that it's one of the measures of success in terms of change. Requires a whole of university organisational approach. I see that organisation word spelt wrong there. Needed when developing Indigenous content in courses. I'm not going to go through this, but this was one of the models, and it is coming out in a publication in a chapter. Charles Darwin University is getting a book together on transitioning people from secondary school through enabling and bridging programs into vet and university before the end of the year. It'll be by Springer, so look out for that. And the book is totally focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people transitioning from schooling or re-engaging with schooling and education. But we explain that model within that chapter. But basically it involves, program design and curriculum, how you look at curriculum, program features, student outcomes, what students see and how they engage, the teacher, and what might the teacher need to reflect on and think about. Thinking about Indigenous success, not just student success, but what do Indigenous young people or older people engaging in VET see for themselves as success? How do you build that into what you're planning as a teacher or an education provider? And then the institution, because none of this exists without the institution as a whole. Some of you here would know that when you get one dynamic, fantastic teacher, they might be terrific, but the system itself is not backing them up, and they struggle. Or you get 1 out of 5. That's what happens. We need the institutions to also be reflecting on that. In terms of future, what people stated and affirmed for us was that first and foremost, to build success and incorporate success for enabling and bridging courses for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students really has to be about affirmation of Indigenous peoples and culture. Really is about affirmation. And we can talk about supporting people, and you can talk about engaging people, you can talk about all those other things, liaising, but at the end of the day, the greatest factor came out was affirmation and respect and affirming Indigenous people and culture. Because I can tell you there are some Indigenous people in some of the work that we had with this, and also in this university, who say, I don't want to have support. I don't need support. I'll get my own things happening. I just want to be affirmed, and then everything from that unfolds. And some of the language we use around that also reeks of that, what I said around that deficit, that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need support, all need to be liaised with, consulted with, engaged with. That's not the case necessarily. Well, it's not the case, as I've been told. Second is fundamental to the strength and success is indigenisation of curriculum and bringing in Indigenous concepts, content, pedagogies and processes within curriculum. And I will say this at this point, it's not just about bringing us in, it's about what non-Indigenous people are also missing out on. How do you look at some concepts of, cooking some kind of foods? I'll go back to cooking because that's what I know. But people who don't know, I was a home ec teacher many years ago, and I did teach catering and hospitality at TAFE as well. So that's one thing that I have, that I do a lot, cook and love food. But when you're trying to teach, how do you teach about using, native ingredients and things without using some Indigenous knowledge around that? How do you do that? And non-Indigenous people are missing out on some of the knowledges that Indigenous people have, and also some of the ways of conveying knowledge that we have that would benefit other people, all people, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm giving more prominence to positive outcomes ahead of the deficit outcomes, and I cannot stress that enough. I cannot stress that enough. Some of the work that I do, communities say, we are sick of hearing how sick we are. We're sick of hearing how disadvantaged we are. We are sick of hearing how, we can't do anything, how unemployed we are, how whatever we are. But we never hear of all the people that are working and the good things, and about our knowledges and about how great we're doing in terms of education and everything else. And so part of that is changing the discourse and the dialogue in enabling and bridging programs as well to reflect all of that. It's not just about Indigenous people here, non-Indigenous people here in that too. Shifting the conscientization, the thinking and realities. I'm shifting from a deficit to recognise and honour strengths and resilience persistence and importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and cultures and outcomes. And that's one of the biggest things I think that we have ahead of us, is around changing some of that dialogue. And leads to the next one about recalibrating the narrative and challenging stereotype and racist views. Oh, you know, we've got this many people in now, but, you know, they're probably not going to finish anyway. And I hear that, some of that language. You may too, but we need to shift that, because I can tell you, if you have Aboriginal and Torres Strait people that hear that too, how do you think that impacts on them? How do you think that comes through in body language, or things that are picked up maybe going down a hallway that people hear, or the, you know, way people carry themselves in going to teach in a room? How do you think that carries? You know, people think, well, they're not even thinking I'm going to succeed here. Might as well give up tomorrow. What's the point of being here? They don't believe in me then. Yeah? I'll just find somewhere else. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. And encourage open and productive work in the intercultural space. And I've named it as that intercultural space between Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous people. You saw the stats that I put up around, you know, it was 700 and something thousand of us in Australia that are Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander. In all of that, if we look at 50% are under 20, and then we take out all the ones that are over 20, and we look at those people with care responsibilities, those people that may have a disability, those people who are older and can't work, those people that may be incarcerated, and you all know those other statistics. How many people do you think are on the ground, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, are going to do this? So the challenge I put out there to you is that this is within your hands. As non-Indigenous people working, not predominantly non-Indigenous people here, working within the vet sector, the bastion of making change is really with you. You know, it is about working jointly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait people to bring about change, but that gap is not going to be closed by a small number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people that work in the sector or who are somehow supporting you. It's everybody together. It has to happen with everybody together. And if that's the main thing you take away today, then that would be really good, to think about how do you work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait people? How do you portray success for students? How do you think about curriculum, or the others that you work with think about curriculum? How do you try and challenge some of that, so you try and embed thoughts of success for Aboriginal and Torres Strait students that are engaged in the sector? So I want you to take that away as a message to take home. They're my contact details. I've got all kinds of contact details. I've got email, I've got Twitter, I've got Facebook, I've got everything. And we have to, don't we? Not sure if any of you know this, and a couple of might. But there's some of the research that's been done on Indigenous people and social media. Indigenous people, social media, proportionately, is 20% higher than non-Indigenous. Okay? Okay? Yeah, remote and urban. And part of the reason for that is because it is communication. The other part is because Aboriginal and Torres Strait people can control it. It's not the dominant media outlets controlling that. So, you know, get onto social media, have a look what people are saying about vet and training and education. I'm going to leave the talk here, the presentation, but we can take some questions.
Let's all thank Bronwyn. So yes, we've got a few minutes for a couple of quick questions. Anyone?
And I will hang around at afternoon tea. I'll come back around afternoon tea if people want to talk to me. Yeah, sure.
Excuse me. I'm curious at that pivotal point where the drop-off occurred at year 7, 8, 9. How much of that do you believe, and does the research show, has to do with actual education? How much do you think it has to do with cultural change and according back to community, according back to family and social structures?
Well, it changes pending community. It changes pending situation. And I think we can't say in one sense it's calling back to community, because if I look at that, what if that person's living in their community? So where are they being called to? You know, so we've got to, it's all around knowing that population or that group you're working with, because some communities have really high people numbers moving through and there's others that aren't. But it can be a whole range of factors. It can be, you know, there's issues around the financial situation of the family. There could be issues around who's caring for children. There could be issues around who's role modelling. There could be issues around puberty. You know, what are the role models being offered to 10, 11, 12-year-old Aboriginal young men and women? Not just in the community from the Aboriginal community's point of view, but non-Indigenous community. What are the strengths being modelled that people feel that need to recede away? Because that's what I see some of that happening, and the data shows that in some communities. One of the investments that we're making here at this university is starting to work with our mentoring program into year 7s and 8s. So looking at that in Gladstone, Rockhampton and Mackay, to try and engage and turn some of that language around in people's heads around that confidence, strengths and being deadly Aboriginal and Torres Strait people at that young age. You know? But I do think it needs to start younger than that in terms of building that so that people are a bit more resilient. Not saying that people don't have resilience, but it's about how do people increase the strategies or their bag of strategies they have to deal with issues.
Look, actually, my question's been answered.
Oh, okay, that's right. All right, well,
All right.
we might move on to the next session, which
Thank
will be
you.
starting about now. So let's thank Bronwyn.